The Mafia boss hid cameras to protect his paralyzed daughter. What he saw made him speechless. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal and redemption, I want to welcome you to our storytelling family. If you haven't joined us yet, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that trust is the only thing that truly matters. Don't forget to comment down below and tell us which part of the world you're watching from. We love reading your messages and feeling the warmth of this incredible community, because here, we are more than just viewers, we are a family. Hubert D'Amico was a name that commanded absolute silence in the darkest corners of the city, a man who ruled a concrete empire with a cold, calculated precision that made him the most feared don in a generation. He was a king of shadows, a man who could move mountains with a single phone call and end lives with a mere nod of his head. Yet when the heavy iron gates of his sprawling estate clicked shut and the world of violence was left behind, Hubert was a man haunted by a silence that no amount of wealth could ever fill. In the streets, he was a god. In the nursery of his daughter, Carla, he was a ghost. The contrast was staggering and cruel. Outside, the air smelled of expensive cigars and the sharp, metallic tang of power. Inside the nursery, it was the sterile, suffocating scent of unmoving air and toys that no one played with anymore. The transition from the fortress of shadows to the room of stillness happened every night at 2 a.m., when the monster of the underworld became a broken father staring at a tragedy he couldn't fix with all the blood money in the world. Everything shifted on that one bitter, rainy night that rewrote the history of the D'Amico bloodline and turned his heart into a fortress of ice. It wasn't an enemy's hit or a rival's ambush that shattered him, but a betrayal that cut deeper and bled longer than any blade. Hubert had arrived home that night expecting the warmth of his wife, Elena, and the loyalty of his closest friend and right-hand man, the person he called his brother. Instead, he found a hollow house, an empty safe, and a note on the pillow that tasted like ash in his mouth. Elena hadn't been kidnapped. She had chosen to walk out on him for the man he trusted most, the man who knew every secret and held every key. The rage that erupted in Hubert was a storm that couldn't be contained by logic or law. He didn't just want them back. He wanted the world to burn for their treachery. The ambush at the crossroad wasn't a tactical maneuver by a rival gang, but a frantic, high-speed pursuit of a man trying to reclaim a life that was already disintegrating. As Hubert's motorcade tore through the rain-slicked streets, chasing the fading taillights of the traitors, a tragic miscalculation occurred in the blind heat of the moment. In the chaos of the high-speed chase, the vehicle carrying little Carla, whom Elena had tried to take as a final, cruel piece of leverage, spun out of control on a sharp bend. The screech of metal against the guardrail echoed like a dying scream into the dark. By the time Hubert reached the wreckage, the traitors had vanished into the mist of the harbor, leaving behind a crumpled car and a broken child. Carla was pulled from the debris, her tiny body limp and terrifyingly silent. The specialists at the private clinic didn't use the language of the streets. They used words that felt like death sentences. Severe spinal damage, permanent loss of sensation, and complete paralysis. They told the most powerful man in the city that his daughter would never walk again. And for the first time in his life, Hubert D'Amico understood that his power was a total lie. He had the whole city in his pocket, but he couldn't give his daughter back her first steps. From that day on, the mansion became a high-security vault, not just to keep enemies out, but to trap the pain in. Hubert's heart turned to stone, his mind poisoned by the memory of the woman who had left them both behind, and he began to see every new face as a potential snake in his garden. He lived his life through a series of glowing monitors, watching the nursery for hours, looking for a sign of movement in Carla's legs that never came, convinced that trust was a dead language that he would never speak again. In the months that followed the betrayal, The D'Amico estate transformed from a home into a silent, gilded tomb built of marble and bulletproof glass. Hubert withdrew into the deep shadows of his mahogany-paneled office, ruling his empire with a cold, renewed ferocity that made even his most loyal soldiers walk on eggshells, while the upper floors of the mansion remained frozen in a time that no longer existed. He tried to buy a solution to his heartbreak, pouring millions into the most advanced medical equipment and a constant stream of high-priced caregivers who arrived at the iron gates with impressive resumes and departed days later with trembling hands and tear-streaked faces. Every woman who entered the house was met not with a father's gratitude, but with the icy, unblinking stare of a man who saw a traitor in every smile and a spy in every gesture. They were terrified, not of the complex task of caring for a paralyzed child, but of the man who paced the hallways like a caged predator, his very presence a heavy, suffocating weight that made the air in the mansion feel thin. One by one, the elite nurses and seasoned nannies crumbled under the crushing pressure of the D'Amico name. Some couldn't handle the oppressive, unnatural silence of the nursery, where Carla sat in her customized chair like a porcelain doll, her dark eyes reflecting a hollow world that no one knew how to reach. Others were driven away by Hubert's impossible standards. He demanded perfection, he demanded miracles, and most of all, he demanded a loyalty that he himself no longer believed existed in the human heart. He would stand in the doorway for hours, his silhouette blocking the light, watching them with eyes that had seen too much blood and too little mercy, waiting for them to slip up, waiting for them to show the same flicker of weakness that had led Elena to walk away. The caregivers felt like they were living under a microscope, and in many ways, they were, as Hubert's obsession with security had turned the house into a labyrinth of sensors and hidden watchpoints. To Hubert, these women were just replaceable components in a machine he was trying to build to protect his daughter from a world that had already broken her. He saw the way they flinched when his security detail walked past with holstered weapons, and he saw the way they looked at Carla, not with the spark of connection, but with a mixture of professional pity and a clinical detachment that made his blood boil. He didn't want their pity. He wanted a miracle that money couldn't buy. As the weeks turned into months, the revolving door of staff only served to deepen his cynical isolation. He became convinced that the world was divided into two types of people, those who were too weak to handle his life, and those who were clever enough to betray it. Carla, sensing the tension and the palpable fear that radiated from the adults around her, retreated even further into her own private silence, her small world shrinking until it consisted only of the four walls of her room and the shifting shadows of the security cameras. The mansion truly was a fortress of solitude, a monument to a man who had all the power in the city but possessed nothing that could truly save his child from the loneliness he had created. It was only when the silence became so loud that it started to echo in his own soul that Hubert realized he was losing his daughter to the shadows as surely as he had lost his wife to the night, leaving him desperate enough to consider a candidate who didn't come from an agency, someone who didn't know the rules of his world, a woman named Nina Barone. Nina Barone arrived at the D'Amico estate not in a luxury car provided by an agency, but on foot, her silhouette emerging from the morning mist like a quiet defiance against the gloom of the massive iron gates. She didn't look like the polished, clinical caregivers who had come before her. She wore a simple, faded coat and carried an air of stillness that seemed to absorb the aggressive tension of the armed men patrolling the perimeter. When the heavy oak doors finally creaked open, she was met with the sight of Hubert D'Amico standing at the top of the grand staircase, his presence like a dark thundercloud hanging over the foyer. Most people lowered their gaze when Hubert looked at them, but Nina did something that made the guards pause in their tracks. She looked him directly in the eyes with a calm, unwavering steadiness that suggested she had seen monsters far worse than him and survived them all. Hubert descended the stairs slowly, his boots clicking rhythmically against the marble like the ticking of a countdown clock, his eyes searching her face for the familiar flicker of fear or the hidden gleam of greed. He found neither. Instead, he saw a woman who looked tired but possessed a resilience that felt like forged steel. He didn't offer a greeting. He offered a warning, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he detailed the strict rules of his house and the absolute consequences of failure. Nina didn't flinch, nor did she interrupt. When he finally stopped, expecting her to stammer or plead for the position, she simply asked where the child was. This refusal to be intimidated by his reputation or his wealth was the first crack in Hubert's icy exterior, though he would never admit it. He led her toward the nursery, his mind already formulating the reasons he would use to dismiss her by sunset. But the moment they crossed the threshold of Carla's room, the atmosphere changed. Carla was slumped in her wheelchair near the window, her back to the door, a tiny island of grief in a sea of expensive, untouched toys. Hubert watched from the shadows of the doorway, expecting Nina to approach with the same saccharine, high-pitched voice the others used. A voice that always made Carla retreat further into her shell. Instead, Nina didn't speak at all. She walked into the center of the room and sat directly on the floor, placing herself at Carla's eye level. She took out a small, worn wooden carving of a bird from her pocket and began to turn it over in her hands, humming a low, melodic tune that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. For the first time in months, Carla's head turned. The little girl looked at the woman on the floor, not with the usual suspicion, but with a sudden, piercing curiosity. Nina didn't rush her. She didn't reach out to touch her or force a connection. She simply waited, her presence a warm hearth in a cold room. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Carla began to navigate her wheelchair closer, her eyes locked on the rhythmic movement of Nina's hands. Hubert felt a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest as he witnessed the impossible. His daughter, the girl who had been a statue of silence for a year, reached out a trembling hand and touched Nina's sleeve. Nina looked up at the girl and gave her a smile that wasn't for Hubert, wasn't for the cameras, and wasn't for the paycheck. It was a smile of pure, recognition-filled love. In that instant, an invisible thread was spun between the two souls, a connection so immediate and profound that even Hubert, in his bottomless cynicism, couldn't deny its power. He saw his daughter's lips part as if she were trying to remember the shape of a word, and for a fleeting second, the King of Shadows felt a spark of something he hadn't felt since the night of the betrayal: hope. But as quickly as it came, his paranoia rushed back to fill the void. He watched them from the doorway, his jaw tight, already wondering what Nina Barone was truly hiding behind those healing hands and that fearless gaze. He decided right then that he would hire her, not because he trusted her, but because he needed to see exactly how she intended to break his heart. He would let her in, but he would be watching every breath she took through the invisible eyes he was about to install in every corner of her world. That night, while the rest of the world slept and the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the sprawling D'Amico grounds, Hubert didn't rest. Instead, he moved through the mansion like a phantom, guided by a singular, burning compulsion that had become his only religion: survival. Driven by his deep-seated Mafia instincts. The same instincts that had allowed him to sniff out rats in his organization for decades. He convinced himself that Nina Barone's effortless connection with Carla was far too perfect to be genuine. In his world, a person who appeared like a saint was usually just a better-funded spy, and the warmth she brought into the house felt like a Trojan horse designed to lower his defenses. With the surgical precision of a man preparing for a war, Hubert began to install the boss's eye, a sophisticated network of high-definition, pinhole cameras hidden within the very fabric of the home. He worked in a cold, focused silence, embedding the tiny, invisible lenses into the eyes of antique paintings, the intricate carvings of the mahogany crown molding, and the subtle gaps in the ventilation grates. He even placed one behind the smoke detector in the hallway and another inside the hollowed-out frame of a mirror in the nursery, ensuring there wasn't a single inch of Nina's life that wouldn't be cataloged, scrutinized, and judged. To Hubert, this wasn't an invasion of privacy. It was a necessary tactical measure, a digital shield for a daughter who had already been betrayed by the woman who gave her life. He sat in his basement, war room, amidst a bank of glowing monitors, watching the first flickering feeds come to life, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens. He watched Nina as she moved through the darkened kitchen in the early hours of the morning, his eyes narrowing as he looked for any sign of her reaching for a phone to contact a rival family or searching his drawers for sensitive documents. He analyzed the way she held a glass of water, the way she paused in the hallway to look at a photograph of the family before the crash, searching for a flicker of malice or the practiced mask of a professional infiltrator. His paranoia was a physical weight, a tightening in his chest that told him it was only a matter of time before the maid with the healing hands revealed her true face. He told himself that he was doing this for Carla, that he was the only thing standing between his paralyzed daughter and another soul-crushing abandonment. But as he stared at the screen, watching Nina quietly fold Carla's laundry with a gentleness that felt suspiciously real, a small, unwanted part of him wondered if he was actually looking for a reason to trust her, or just a reason to finally destroy his own capacity for hope. He went to bed as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, his finger hovering over the record button, a king in a fortress of glass, waiting for the one mistake that would prove the whole world was as dark as his own heart. He had built a cage of invisible eyes, and now, all he had to do was wait for the bird to stop singing and start showing its claws. The following morning, Hubert retreated to the cold, blue-lit sanctuary of his surveillance room, his heart a coiled spring of suspicion as he adjusted the dials to bring the kitchen feed into sharp focus. He expected to see Nina lazily checking her phone or perhaps rummaging through the mahogany cabinets for silver to pawn, but what he witnessed through the high-definition lens left him utterly motionless, his breath hitching in his throat. In the center of the vast, sterile kitchen, Nina had transformed the granite island into a stage of clattering rhythm and improvised joy. She wasn't just cooking. She was performing a symphony of the absurd, wearing two stainless steel pot lids on her head like oversized, shimmering Mickey Mouse ears while dancing a clumsy, light-hearted jig. Hubert watched, speechless, as she picked up a wooden spoon like a conductor's baton, tapping out a playful beat on the bottoms of copper pans to catch Carla's attention. Carla sat in her wheelchair, her small body usually so rigid and guarded, but as Nina began to sing a ridiculous, made-up song about a princess who lived in a soup pot, something miraculous flickered across the little girl's face. For the first time since the night the world broke, Carla's lips didn't just twitch. They curled upward into a genuine, toothy grin. The sound that followed was a soft, melodic hiccup of air that Hubert hadn't heard in an eternity. His daughter was laughing. It was a fragile, crystalline sound that pierced through the electronic hum of the monitors and struck Hubert directly in his hardened chest. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes stinging, as he watched Nina abandon her dignity entirely, using the reflective surfaces of the lids to play peek-boo with the morning sunlight, bouncing golden beams across the ceiling to stimulate Carla's wandering gaze. Nina was purposefully creating a sensory explosion of sound, light, and movement, her every silly action designed with a hidden, expert precision to draw Carla out of her internal fog. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like a lifeline. Hubert stared at the monitor, his hands trembling slightly on the edge of the desk, realizing that while he had spent a fortune on high-tech medical sensors to monitor his daughter's vitals, he had completely overlooked the medicine of a simple, joyful moment. He saw Nina gently take Carla's small, limp hand and help her play the drums on a pot lid, encouraging the girl to feel the vibration of the metal. There was no audience, no one for Nina to impress, and no reason for her to act this way unless she truly, deeply cared. In that moment, the King of Shadows felt his terrifying certainty begin to crumble. He had searched for a spy, a thief, or a traitor through his invisible eyes, but instead, he had found a miracle in the form of a woman who wasn't afraid to be a fool if it meant his daughter felt alive for just 1 second. He sat back in his chair, the glow of the screens reflecting in his dark eyes, paralyzed by a realization that no bullet could have delivered. The most dangerous thing in his house wasn't an assassin, but the possibility that Nina Barone might actually be the one thing he believed no longer existed, someone who loved without an agenda. He remained there for a long time after the laughter died down, watching the silent replay of the pot-lid dance, a man caught between the safety of his paranoia and the terrifying, beautiful light of the truth. The seeds of doubt were difficult to uproot, even in the fertile soil of Carla's newfound laughter, and so Hubert retreated once more into the cold, strategic logic that had kept him alive in a world of wolves. He sat in his darkened study, the blue light of the monitors casting long, skeletal shadows against the mahogany walls, and picked up the secure phone that connected him to the city's deepest veins of information. He didn't just want a background check. He wanted a dissection of Nina Barone's soul. Within hours, the mob resources he commanded, the hackers, the fixers, and the men who traded in secrets, began to feed him fragments of a life that had been carefully tucked away from the prying eyes of the public. As the encrypted files flooded his screen, Hubert found himself staring not at the profile of a criminal or a plant, but at the tragic blueprint of a healer broken by the very world he inhabited. Nina hadn't always been a maid looking for work in the mansions of the elite. She had once been a rising star in the world of pediatric neurology and physical therapy, a woman who possessed a brilliant mind and a heart that refused to accept the finality of a permanent diagnosis. But as Hubert scrolled through the digital graveyard of her past, he found the reason for her fall from grace. Her own family had been caught in the crossfire of a territorial dispute between rival factions, an underworld war that had nothing to do with her, yet took everything from her. Her younger brother, a boy who had looked so much like Carla in his wide-eyed innocence, had been paralyzed in the same senseless violence that eventually claimed their parents. Nina had abandoned her residency and her dreams to become his sole caretaker, pouring every ounce of her medical knowledge and her meager savings into his recovery. She had fought the healthcare system and the street gangs alike, but in the end, the shadows had won, leaving her alone with a mountain of debt and a heart that had been hollowed out by grief. Hubert leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the mansion suddenly feeling heavy with the weight of her history. He realized then that the secret therapy he saw her performing on Carla wasn't a trick or a preamble to a kidnapping. It was the same desperate, loving work she had done for her brother. She wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who had been forged in the same fire as him. But while the flames had turned Hubert into a stone fortress, they had turned Nina into a soft, glowing light for those lost in the dark. He looked at the photographs of her younger years, the white coat, the stethoscope, the smile that reached her eyes, and contrasted it with the woman who now cleaned his floors and wore a simple apron. She had lost her career because she refused to give up on a child the world had written off. And now, by a twist of fate that felt like a mockery of his own paranoia, she was doing the same for his daughter. Hubert felt a sudden, sharp pang of shame that cut through his cynical armor. He had used the full weight of his criminal empire to dig for dirt, only to find a diamond buried in the ash. He realized that Nina wasn't in his house to destroy him. She was there because she understood his pain better than anyone else ever could. Yet, even as this truth settled into his bones, the habits of a lifetime were hard to break. He watched her on the monitor as she sat by Carla's bed, reading a story in a low, soothing voice. And he felt a terrifying urge to walk upstairs and apologize. But the boss inside him remained seated, anchored by the fear that if he lowered the gates now, he might never be able to close them again. He had found her past, but in doing so, he had only made his own present more complicated, trapped between the man who demanded total surveillance and the father who was starting to believe in the impossible. The atmosphere within the D'Amico estate had begun to shift, the heavy, oppressive silence of the past year replaced by a tentative, fragile hum of life that Hubert found both intoxicating and terrifying. He spent more time in the surveillance room than ever before, but his focus had undergone a profound transformation. He was no longer looking for a reason to exile Nina, but was instead addicted to the grace she brought into his home. One afternoon, while the golden hour sunlight filtered through the nursery windows, Hubert sat mesmerized by the monitor as Nina worked through a series of gentle stretching exercises with Carla. The room was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of Nina's voice, a low melodic murmur that seemed to act as a tether for Carla's wandering spirit. Nina was holding Carla's small hands in hers, swaying gently back and forth, when the impossible happened, a sound that shattered Hubert's stoicism and sent a jolt of pure electricity through his heart. Carla's chest hitched, her tiny throat working with a desperate, new effort, and through the speakers of the surveillance system came a soft, cracked vocalization that was unmistakably Ma. It was a single syllable, breathless and raw, but it carried the weight of 1,000 prayers. Hubert froze, his fingers digging into the edge of his desk as he watched Nina's reaction. She didn't pull away or correct the child, but instead pulled Carla into a fierce, tearful embrace, whispering back that she was there, that she would always be there. In that moment, Hubert felt a wall inside him crumble into dust. He looked at Nina through the grainy digital feed and realized he wasn't just watching a caregiver. He was watching the heart of his home beat again. He saw the way the light caught the stray hairs on her neck, the genuine devotion in her eyes, and the way she held his daughter as if she were her own flesh and blood. A terrifyingly warm realization washed over him. He was falling in love with the woman he was treating like a criminal. The irony was a jagged blade in his chest. He was falling for her precisely because of the beautiful, intimate moments he had stolen through a lens she didn't know was there. He felt like a voyeur of his own happiness, a man standing outside in the cold watching a fire he was too afraid to join. His Mafia instinct screamed at him that this was a vulnerability, a weakness that could be used against him, but the father in him was finally beginning to drown out the dawn. He watched Nina kiss the top of Carla's head, and for the first time in his life, Hubert D'Amico felt the crushing weight of his own deception. He wanted to run up the stairs, burst through the door, and pull them both into his arms, but he remained anchored to his chair by the paralyzing fear of his own shadow. He had built a life on surveillance and secrets, and now, the very woman who had brought his daughter back to life was the one person he was betraying every single second with the boss's eye. He realized that while Carla was finally finding her voice, he was losing his own, trapped in a silent cage of his own making, desperately in love with a woman who had no idea she was being watched by a man who was supposed to be her protector but had become her invisible judge. The fragile peace that had begun to settle over the D'Amico estate was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that started with the promise of a breakthrough but ended in a catastrophic collision of two different worlds. Nina was in the nursery, laughing as she helped Carla stack a tower of wooden blocks, the child's giggles filling the room with a music that had become Hubert's new heartbeat. As Carla reached for a block, her hand slipped, and a small, cherished figurine rolled beneath the heavy mahogany dresser that lined the far wall. Nina knelt, her fingers brushing against the floor as she reached into the shadows to retrieve it, but her hand didn't find wood. It brushed against a cold, metallic protrusion concealed behind a decorative molding. At first, she thought it was a loose screw or a piece of the child's medical equipment, but as she leaned in closer, the light from the window caught the unmistakable, glinting iris of a pinhole camera lens. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A cold, sickening dread washed over her as she stood up, her eyes darting around the room with a new, terrified clarity. She began to see them everywhere. The tiny, unnatural circles hidden in the ornate crown molding, the suspicious gleam behind the smoke detector, and the dark, unblinking eye staring back at her from the frame of the mirror where she had just been brushing Carla's hair. Each discovery was a fresh puncture wound to her spirit. In the surveillance room below, Hubert watched the screen with a mounting sense of horror, his blood turning to ice as he saw Nina freeze, her face draining of color until she looked like a marble statue of grief. He saw the exact moment her heart broke. It wasn't a slow realization, but a violent, soul-crushing revelation that every intimate moment, every tear she had shed with Carla, and every secret hope she had whispered into the child's ear had been recorded, analyzed, and treated as evidence in a trial she didn't know she was attending. Hubert rushed from his chair, his boots echoing like thunder as he tore through the hallways, desperate to reach her before the damage became permanent. But when he burst through the nursery doors, he wasn't met by a cowering maid. He was met by a woman whose eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 betrayed promises. Nina stood her ground, her hand protectively on Carla's shoulder, as she held up one of the tiny cameras she had managed to pry loose. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the powerful Don feel smaller than he ever had in his life. She didn't ask why he had done it. She told him that he was exactly who the world said he was. A man so hollowed out by fear that he couldn't recognize love even when it was saving his daughter's life. She spoke of how she had seen him not as a monster, but as a hurting father, only to find out that to him, she was just another enemy to be monitored, another potential traitor in his high-security cage. The heartbreak in her voice was a jagged blade that cut through Hubert's last remaining defenses. He tried to speak, to explain the hit on the harbor and the note on the pillow, but the words betrayal and protection felt like ash in the air. Nina didn't wait for his excuses. She looked at Carla, her eyes brimming with a devastating sorrow, and whispered a goodbye that tore the room apart. She didn't take any of the money Hubert tried to thrust upon her, nor did she take the luxury items he had bought to show his appreciation. She simply walked out of the nursery, her head held high, leaving behind the simple apron that had become a symbol of hope in a house of shadows. As the heavy iron gates of the estate clicked shut behind her, the mansion plummeted back into a silence that was louder and more terrifying than anything Hubert had ever experienced. He stood in the center of the nursery, surrounded by the invisible eyes he had installed to protect his world, and realized that in his obsession with not being betrayed again, he had committed the ultimate betrayal himself. He had guarded the fortress, but he had let the light slip through his fingers, leaving him alone in the dark with nothing but a daughter who had stopped smiling and a screen that showed only an empty room. The days following Nina's departure were the darkest the D'Amico estate had ever known, a hollow eternity where the air felt thin and the very walls seemed to weep with the weight of Hubert's regret. The monitors in the basement war room remained active, but Hubert couldn't bring himself to look at them. The sight of the empty nursery and Carla's tear-stained face was a torture more refined than anything his enemies could have devised. He watched his daughter wither, her newfound voice retreating back into a defensive silence, and her eyes losing the spark that Nina had so painstakingly ignited. It was in the middle of a sleepless night, as he stared at the mountain of surveillance equipment he had built to protect his pride, that Hubert realized his power was a prison and his suspicion was the warden. He didn't just want Nina back for Carla. He needed her to save his own dying soul. Breaking every rule of his clandestine life, Hubert abandoned his security detail, and drove himself into the city's forgotten corners. Guided by the files he had once used to judge her, he found her at a small, crowded community shelter in a neighborhood where his name carried no weight, a place where people were defined by their struggle rather than their status. When he found Nina, she was helping a young boy with his crutches, her face weary, but her spirit still radiating that same unyielding light. She didn't look at him with fear when he approached, only a profound, quiet disappointment that hurt more than a physical blow. Hubert didn't demand or threaten. For the first time in his life, the Mafia boss knelt in a place he didn't own and begged for a mercy he didn't deserve. He told her about the note on the pillow and the harbor road, but he didn't use them as excuses. He used them as a confession of his own brokenness. He promised her that the cameras were gone, but Nina's response was a sharp reminder that trust wasn't a transaction. She told him that she didn't want his promises. She wanted a home where she wasn't a suspect. Hubert drove her back to the mansion in a silence that felt heavy with the possibility of a new beginning. When they arrived, he didn't lead her to the nursery. He led her to the basement war room. In a frantic, symbolic act of destruction, Hubert grabbed a heavy brass lamp and began to smash the monitors, the glass shattering and the electronic hum dying out as the screens went dark. He tore the servers from the racks and threw the recording drives onto the floor, crushing them beneath his boots until the boss's eye was nothing more than a pile of useless scrap. When the last lens was broken and the last wire severed, he turned to Nina, his chest heaving and his eyes wet with a vulnerability he hadn't shown since childhood. He told her that from this day forward, there would be no more shadows between them, and that if she stayed, it would be as a partner in Carla's life, not an employee in his fortress. Nina looked at the wreckage of his paranoia, and then at the man standing amidst the debris, and she saw the father who was finally willing to be seen. They walked up the stairs together, and the moment Carla saw Nina standing in the doorway, the girl let out a cry of pure, unfiltered joy that echoed through the marble halls. In the weeks that followed, the mansion was transformed. The cameras were replaced by family photographs, and the heavy silence was drowned out by the sound of laughter and music. Hubert scaled back his operations, choosing to be a man of his house rather than a king of the streets, and with Nina's expert guidance, Carla began the grueling, beautiful process of healing. A year later, in a small, private ceremony held in the garden where the roses finally smelled of life again, Hubert and Nina were married. As they stood before a small group of friends, Carla, supported by a set of light braces and Nina's steady hand, took 3 trembling, proud steps toward her father. There were no cameras to record the moment, no sensors to track the progress, and no eyes watching from the walls. There was only the truth of a family reborn, standing firm on a new foundation built not on the shifting sands of fear and surveillance, but on the unbreakable rock of trust. Hubert D'Amico finally understood that the greatest protection he could ever give his daughter wasn't a fortress of glass, but a home where she was loved without condition. Thank you so much for walking this emotional journey with us today. It truly means the world to me that you've shared your time to hear the story of Hubert, Nina, and little Carla. We believe that stories like these remind us all that no matter how much pain or betrayal we face, there is always a path back to trust if we are brave enough to let go of our fear. You are more than just a viewer to us. You are a vital part of our storytelling family. We love having you here, and we want you to feel at home every time you visit our channel. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to join our growing family so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Share this story with someone you know who might be struggling to trust again. You never know whose life you might change just by hitting that share button. I would love to hear from you in the comments. We read every single one, so please let us know. Where in the world are you watching from today? Do you think Hubert was right to be so suspicious after being betrayed by his wife and best friend? Or was he wrong to ever hide those cameras? Have you ever had a Nina in your life? Someone who came along and helped you heal when you thought it was impossible?